The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as Prince Louis walked down the marble corridor toward the stateroom. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors, creating a rhythm that had become familiar to everyone in the palace. At 25 years old, Louis had grown into a confident young man who carried himself with the quiet dignity expected of a member of the royal family. The palace staff nodded respectfully as he passed. Maria, the head housekeeper who had worked there for 30 years, smiled warmly. She had watched Louis grow from a curious child who asked endless questions about the palace's history to the thoughtful prince he had become. Thomas, the elderly butler, straightened his tie and gave a small bow. These were people who had become like family to Louis over the years. Today was different from other days, though Louis couldn't quite put his finger on why. There was an energy in the air, a sense that something important was about to happen. The Queen had called for an informal gathering in the stateroom to discuss upcoming royal engagements. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, the kind they held every few weeks to coordinate schedules and public appearances. As Louis approached the stateroom, he could hear voices inside. His grandmother's voice was clear and strong, discussing the details of an upcoming charity gala. His father's deeper tone occasionally interrupted with questions about security arrangements. His aunt's laugh rang out at something amusing someone had said. It was the sound of family, comfortable and familiar. Louis paused for a moment outside the door, adjusting his tie and running a hand through his hair. He had always been the youngest in these meetings, often feeling like he was still proving himself worthy of being included in important family discussions. But lately, he had been taking on more responsibilities, representing the royal family at various events and causes that mattered to him. When he entered the room, the conversation continued without pause. The Queen sat in her favorite chair, a cup of tea balanced perfectly on the armrest. She wore a pale blue dress with a simple pearl necklace, looking every bit the monarch she had been for decades. Her eyes held the same sharp intelligence they always had, missing nothing that happened around her. Prince Charles sat across from her, reviewing a folder of documents. Princess Anne stood by the window, looking out at the garden while listening to the discussion. Other family members filled the remaining chairs, creating a circle of familiar faces that had shaped Louis's entire life. But today, something felt different in this room. Louis noticed it immediately as he took his usual seat. There was a man standing near the back wall, someone he had never seen before. The stranger wore a simple dark suit and stood quietly, almost invisible among the ornate decorations of the stateroom. His presence seemed unremarkable, yet something about him caught Louis's attention. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with gray hair and weathered hands that spoke of a life spent working with them. His posture was straight but not stiff, respectful but not servile. Most remarkably, his eyes held a depth that suggested he had seen much of the world beyond palace walls. Louis found himself studying this stranger while pretending to listen to the conversation about upcoming royal tours. Who was this man? Why was he here? In all his years attending these family meetings, Louis had never seen anyone outside. The immediate family and their closest advisors present for these discussions. The Queen seemed completely comfortable with the man's presence, which told Louis that she knew him well. But from where? And why had Louis never encountered him before? The mystery gnawed at him, making it difficult to focus on the discussion about charity events and state dinners. As the meeting progressed, Louis continued to steal glances at the stranger. The man never spoke, never moved from his position by the wall, and never seemed to draw attention to himself. Yet somehow, his presence filled the room in a way that Louis couldn't explain. Princess Anne was discussing plans for a veterans event when something shifted in the atmosphere. The stranger took a small step forward, just enough to move him slightly closer to the family circle. It was such a minor movement that most people might not have noticed it, but Louis saw it clearly. The Queen's conversation slowed, then stopped entirely. She turned her head slightly toward the man, and for a moment their eyes met. In that brief exchange, Louis saw something pass between them, a communication that needed no words, an understanding built over years of shared experience. It was then that Louis began to realize this was no ordinary palace staff member. This was someone important, someone whose presence here meant something significant was about to happen. The way the queen looked at him, the way the man carried himself, the way the very air in the room seemed to change when he moved, all of it pointed to a story that Louis didn't yet know. The stranger's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in each family member with careful attention. When his gaze finally settled on Louis, the young prince felt a strange sensation, as if he were being evaluated or measured in some way. The man's expression remained neutral, but Louis sensed a deep intelligence behind those eyes, a wisdom earned through experiences that probably differed greatly from royal life. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, the queen set down her teacup with deliberate care. The small sounds seemed to signal something to everyone in the room. Conversations died away and all attention turned to her. She looked once more at the stranger, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Louis felt his heart begin to beat faster. Whatever was about to happen, he sensed it would change something fundamental about this ordinary family meeting. The stranger took another step forward, and this time, everyone in the room noticed. The moment stretched out, filled with anticipation and an energy that seemed to electrify the very air they breathed. The queen stood slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful despite her age. The room fell completely silent as every member of the royal family turned their full attention to her. Louis had seen his grandmother command respect countless times, but this moment felt different. There was a solemnity in the air that made his pulse quicken. "I believe it's time," the queen said softly, her words carrying clearly in the hushed room. She looked directly at the stranger, who stepped forward with quiet dignity. As he moved closer to the family circle, Louis could see more details about this mysterious man. His hands, though weathered, moved with precision and care. His suit, while simple, was perfectly pressed and properly fitted. Most telling of all, his bearing showed no nervousness or uncertainty. This was a man comfortable in the presence of royalty, someone who belonged here despite his unknown identity. The queen gestured for the man to come closer. "Everyone, I would like you to meet James Mitchell," she began, her voice carrying the weight of importance. Sergeant Major Mitchell, to be more precise, though he retired from that position 40 years ago. Louis felt his breath catch. A sergeant major. That explained the man's bearing, the straight posture, the calm confidence. But why was a retired military man here in their family meeting? And why did the queen speak his name with such obvious respect and warmth? James served with distinction in several conflicts that most of the public never knew about, the queen continued. Operations that remained classified for decades, missions that protected our national security and saved countless lives. More importantly to our family, James served as my personal protection detail during some of the most dangerous years of my reign. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Louis had heard stories about threats to the royal family over the years, but they had always seemed distant and abstract. The idea that his grandmother had faced real danger, protected by men like James Mitchell, made those threats suddenly very real and personal. Prince Charles leaned forward in his chair, his expression showing recognition. "The incident in 1982, he said quietly. "You were there." James nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Louis had no idea what incident his father referred to, but the way both men's faces grew serious told him it had been significant and dangerous. "James saved my life that day," the queen said simply. "Not just mine, but potentially several members of our family. He put himself between our family and harm without hesitation, without thought for his own safety. And he's never spoken publicly about it, never sought recognition or reward." Louis looked at James Mitchell with new eyes. This quiet, unassuming man had been a guardian angel to his family, a protector whose service had remained hidden in the shadows for decades. The weight of that sacrifice, the years of keeping silent about such significant service, struck Louis deeply. "But today is different," the queen continued. "James has been fighting a battle of his own for the past 2 years, a battle against an illness that will eventually win, despite his strength and courage." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Louis felt his chest tighten as the meaning became clear. This man who had protected his family was now facing his own mortality. And somehow that had brought him here today. James Mitchell's expression remained steady, but Louis could see something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. Not fear, but perhaps a quiet acceptance, a peace with whatever was coming. It was the look of a man who had lived fully and served completely. James asked for nothing, the Queen said, her voice growing softer but no less clear. Even facing what he's facing, he asked for nothing for himself. Instead, he made a single request. He wanted to meet the younger members of our family, to see for himself that the people he spent his career protecting were worthy of that protection. The statement struck Louis like a physical blow. This man had risked his life for their family, had kept their secrets, had served without recognition, and now in his final months, he wanted only to see if they had grown into people worthy of his sacrifice. Louis looked around the room at his family members. He could see the same realization hitting each of them. This wasn't just a meeting or a casual introduction. This was a moment of accountability, a chance for James Mitchell to judge whether his life's work had been worthwhile. Princess Anne stepped forward first, extending her hand to James. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. For everything you've done, for everything you've never told, for the protection you gave us when we didn't even know we needed it." James shook her hand with a slight smile. "Your Royal Highness," he replied, his voice carrying a slight northern accent that spoke of working-class roots. "It was my honor to serve." One by one, other family members approached James Mitchell. Each conversation was brief but meaningful, filled with gratitude and respect. Louis watched these exchanges, feeling something building inside him that he couldn't quite name. It was bigger than gratitude, deeper than respect. When the conversations ended, an unusual quiet settled over the room. James Mitchell had stepped back to his original position, but now everyone in the room looked at him differently. He was no longer a stranger or even just a former protector. He had become something more significant. A reminder of the real meaning behind their privileged positions. Louis found himself thinking about his own life, his own responsibilities. He had always understood that being royal meant serving the public, representing the crown with dignity and purpose. But James Mitchell's presence made those concepts feel more real and immediate than they ever had before. The Queen looked around the room at her family, her expression thoughtful. "James will be staying at the palace for the next few days," she announced. "I hope you'll all take the opportunity to spend time with him, to learn from him, to understand what true service really means." As the formal meeting began to wind down, Louis remained in his seat while others started to leave. He couldn't stop looking at James Mitchell, couldn't stop thinking about the man's quiet strength and dignity. Here was someone who had lived a life of genuine meaning, who had made sacrifices that mattered, who had served something greater than himself without seeking glory or recognition. When most of the room had cleared, Louis finally stood up and approached James Mitchell. The older man watched him come, his expression patient and kind. "Sir," Louis began, then stopped. The words seemed inadequate for what he wanted to say. "How do you thank someone for saving your grandmother's life? How do you express gratitude for decades of silent protection?" James Mitchell studied Prince Louis with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the meeting. Up close, Louis could see the lines around the man's eyes, marks left by years of scanning for threats, watching for danger, staying alert when others could rest safely. "You don't need to say anything, Your Royal Highness," James said gently. "That's not why I'm here." But Louis felt compelled to speak. "I want to understand," he said. "I want to know what you did for us, what you sacrificed. My whole life I've been protected, but I never really knew by whom or at what cost." James nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. "Walk with me," he suggested, gesturing toward the long corridor that led to the palace gardens. "Sometimes these conversations are easier when you're moving." They left the stateroom together, their footsteps creating a steady rhythm on the marble floors. Palace staff they passed showed James the same respectful acknowledgement they gave to Louis, but there was something extra in their gestures. Word had spread quickly through the palace about who James Mitchell was and why he was there. "Your grandmother was 28 when I first joined her protection detail," James began as they walked. "She had been queen for only a few years, and the world was a dangerous place. Different kind of dangerous than today, but dangerous nonetheless." Louis listened intently, trying to imagine his grandmother as a young woman, facing threats he had never considered. "There were letters," James continued. "Threats from people who opposed the monarchy, from those who blamed the royal family for various political situations. Most were empty threats from people who would never act. But some were real." They paused at a large window overlooking the gardens. James stood quietly for a moment, his eyes distant, clearly remembering events from decades past. "The incident your father mentioned in 1982, James said slowly. "Your grandmother was attending a charity function at a hotel in London. We had checked everything, secured every entrance, vetted every person who would be in attendance. But someone found a way in." Louis felt his stomach tighten. He had never heard this story, had never known his grandmother had faced such direct danger. "A man with a knife," James continued. "He got within 10 feet of Her Majesty before we spotted him. In situations like that, you don't have time to think. You just react based on your training and your commitment to the person you're protecting. What happened?" Louis asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I put myself between him and your grandmother," James said simply. "Took the knife across my ribs instead of letting it reach her. The scar is still there, 43 years later." The casual way James spoke about nearly dying to protect Louis's grandmother made the young prince's chest tighten with emotion. This man had literally bled for their family, had been willing to die for them, and had carried that scar in silence for decades. "But that wasn't the end of it," James continued. "We learned later that the attack was meant to be a distraction. There were others planning something much larger, something that could have changed the course of British history. Because we stopped the first attempt, we were able to prevent the second." They began walking again, moving toward the gardens where the afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light. Louis processed what he was hearing, trying to understand the full scope of what James Mitchell and others like him had done for his family. "Why didn't anyone ever tell us these stories?" Louis asked. "Because that wasn't the point," James replied. "Our job was to keep you safe, not to make you afraid. Your grandmother wanted her family to live normal lives as much as possible, to focus on their duties to the country rather than worrying about personal safety." They entered the gardens, where the smell of roses filled the air and the sounds of London traffic seemed distant and muted. This was Louis's favorite place in the palace, where he had played as a child and often came to think as an adult. "I've watched your family from a distance for years after my active service ended," James said. "I've seen how each of you has grown into your roles, how you've handled the pressures and responsibilities of royal life. Your grandmother wanted me to see for myself what kind of people you had become." Louis felt the weight of that statement. This man was evaluating whether their family had justified his sacrifices, whether the risks he had taken and the pain he had endured had been worthwhile. "And what do you think?" Louis asked, genuinely concerned about the answer. James stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "I think your grandmother raised a family that understands service," he said. "I see young people who take their responsibilities seriously, who care about something bigger than themselves." The words brought relief, but also a deeper sense of responsibility. Louis realized that James Mitchell represented something important, a standard of service and sacrifice that his family needed to live up to every day. "But I also see young people who haven't been tested," James continued, "who haven't faced real hardship or real danger. And I wonder if you truly understand what it means to serve others when it costs you something significant." The observation hit Louis harder than any criticism could have. James wasn't attacking him or his family, but he was pointing out a truth that Louis had been dimly aware of but never fully faced. Their lives, while filled with duty and responsibility, had been cushioned from real danger, real sacrifice. "What would you want us to do differently?" Louis asked. James smiled for the first time since Louis had met him. "I don't want you to do anything differently," he said. I want you to understand what you're carrying forward. The monarchy isn't just about ceremonies and state dinners. It's about representing ideals that are worth protecting, values that are worth sacrificing for. They sat down on a bench overlooking the garden's central fountain. The water's gentle splashing created a peaceful backdrop for their conversation. Your grandmother has carried that weight for 70 years? James said. She's made personal sacrifices that the public will never know about, given up things that mattered to her personally for the sake of the crown and the country. That's what real service looks like. Louis thought about his grandmother, about the strength and dignity she had shown throughout her reign. He had always admired her, but James's words helped him see her in a new light. As someone who had paid personal costs for her public service, I want to be worthy of that, Louis said quietly. Wanting is a good start, James replied. But it's the doing that matters. And sometimes the doing means making choices that hurt, giving up things you want for things that matter more. As they sat in the peaceful garden, Louis felt something shifting inside him. James Mitchell's presence had brought a new perspective to his understanding of royal duty, a deeper appreciation for what service really meant. Over the next 2 days, Louis found himself seeking out James Mitchell whenever possible. The older man had been given comfortable quarters in the palace and seemed content to spend his time reading in the library or walking through the gardens. But Louis discovered that James was always willing to talk, always ready to share stories that illuminated aspects of royal life that Louis had never considered. On the second evening, they sat together in the small sitting room adjacent to the library. James had been telling Louis about other members of the protection details over the years, men and women who had dedicated their careers to keeping the royal family safe. There was Margaret Thompson, James said, a smile crossing his face. Served as part of your grandmother's detail for 15 years. Toughest woman I ever met. She once noticed that a waiter at a state dinner was nervous, sweating more than he should have been given the temperature in the room. Louis leaned forward, intrigued by the story. Margaret positioned herself so she could watch this waiter throughout the entire dinner, James continued. Sure enough, he started moving toward your grandmother's table with what looked like a normal water pitcher. Margaret intercepted him just as he was reaching into his jacket. Turned out he had a small vial of poison that he planned to slip into her drink. What happened to him? Louis asked. Arrested quietly, questioned, and we learned he was part of a larger group planning multiple attacks. Because Margaret caught him before he could act, we were able to prevent 3 other attempts that week. Louis shook his head in amazement. And we never knew any of this was happening. That was the point, James said. Your family was able to continue their duties, meet with world leaders, attend public functions, because you didn't have to worry about these threats. We handled them so you could focus on serving the country. As James spoke, Louis began to understand the invisible network of protection that had surrounded his family for generations. People like James and Margaret had made personal sacrifices, taken physical risks, and carried heavy burdens so that the royal family could function effectively. James, Louis said slowly, there's something I want to tell you about myself, something I've been thinking about since we started talking. The older man waited patiently, his expression encouraging Louis to continue. I've been considering leaving, Louis said. Not forever, but taking a break from royal duties. I've been offered a position with a humanitarian organization working in developing countries. Real work, away from ceremonies and photo opportunities. I thought maybe I could make a bigger difference outside the royal system. James listened without judgment, his expression thoughtful but not surprised. Tell me about this organization, he said. Louis explained the offer he had received to work with a group providing clean water systems to remote villages in Africa. The work would be physically demanding and potentially dangerous. It would require him to live in basic conditions, work alongside local communities, and use his hands to build something tangible and immediately helpful. It sounds meaningful, James said when Louis finished. But I'm curious about something. Why do you think you need to leave the royal family to make a real difference? The question caught Louis off guard. He had been so focused on the appeal of the humanitarian work that he hadn't really examined his assumption that meaningful service required abandoning his royal position. I suppose I feel like everything I do as a prince is symbolic, Louis said. Ribbon cuttings, charity galas, state dinners. Important maybe, but not real in the way that building a well for people who don't have clean water would be real. James nodded thoughtfully. I understand that feeling, he said. But let me ask you something. Do you think your grandmother's work has been real? Do you think the meetings she's had with world leaders, the treaties she's witnessed, the stability she's provided during times of crisis have been just symbolic? Louis felt a flush of embarrassment. No, of course not. Grandmother's work has been incredibly important. But it's not the same as building wells, James pointed out. So what makes it real and meaningful? Louis thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. I suppose it's real because it affects people's lives in important ways, even if those effects aren't always visible or immediate. Exactly, James said. And do you think that kind of impact is less valuable than the more tangible work you're considering? The question forced Louis to examine his assumptions more carefully. He had been thinking about meaningful service in very narrow terms, equating value with physical, immediate results. But James was suggesting a broader understanding of how someone could make a difference. There's something else I want you to consider, James continued. The position you're thinking about leaving that role as a prince, it's not just a job you can walk away from and then pick up again later. When you represent the crown, you carry forward something that's bigger than yourself, something that connects to centuries of British history and traditions. Louis felt the weight of that statement. He had always understood that his royal position came with responsibilities, but James was helping him see it as something more significant, more connected to the larger story of the country and its people. The work you're considering in Africa is admirable, James said, but there are thousands of people who could do that work. How many people can do what you do as a member of the royal family? How many people can carry forward the traditions and stability that the monarchy represents? It was a sobering thought. Louis had been so focused on wanting to do something that felt immediately meaningful that he hadn't considered the unique value of his royal role. The ways that only he and other family members could serve the country and the Commonwealth. I'm not saying you shouldn't consider other ways to serve, James added, but I am suggesting that you think carefully about whether leaving your royal duties is necessary to find meaningful work, or whether you could find ways to make your royal work more meaningful. That evening, Louis lay in bed thinking about his conversation with James. The humanitarian work still appealed to him, but he was beginning to see it differently. Instead of an escape from meaningless royal duties, he was starting to think about it as a potential way to enhance his effectiveness as a prince. What if he could use his royal platform to bring attention to clean water issues? What if he could leverage his position to raise funds and awareness for the kinds of projects that appealed to him? What if his royal status could amplify the impact of humanitarian work rather than prevent him from doing it? The next morning, Louis sought out James again, this time with a new perspective on their previous conversation. He found the older man in the garden, reading a newspaper in the early morning sunlight. I've been thinking about what you said, Louis began. About finding ways to make royal work more meaningful rather than abandoning it for other kinds of service. James looked up from his paper, his expression interested and encouraging. What if I could use my position to support the kind of humanitarian work that matters to me? Louis continued. Not instead of royal duties, but as part of them. Using the platform that comes with being a prince to shine light on issues that need attention. A smile crossed James's face. Now you're thinking like someone who understands what real service means, he said. You're thinking about how to maximize your impact rather than just how to feel better about your work. The third day of James Mitchell's visit dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that matched Louis's contemplative mood. He had spent the night wrestling with a growing understanding of what James's presence really meant. Not just to his family, but to his own sense of purpose and responsibility. After breakfast, Louis found James in the palace library, carefully examining a display case filled with medals and commendations. The older man stood quietly, studying each piece with the attention of someone who understood their significance. "Those belong to my great-grandfather," Louis said, approaching the case. "He served in the First World War." James nodded, his eyes still focused on the medals. "Distinguished Service Order," he said, identifying one of the decorations. "He would have earned that for exceptional leadership under fire. Probably saved lives." Louis looked at the medals with new appreciation. They had always been there, part of the palace's historical displays. But he had never really considered what they represented in terms of personal sacrifice and courage. "Your family has a long tradition of service," James observed. "Not just your great-grandfather, but members of every generation who have understood that privilege comes with responsibility." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the weight of history contained in those small pieces of metal and ribbon. "James," Louis said finally, "I want you to know that meeting you has changed something for me. Not just about how I see royal duty, but about how I see myself." The older man turned to face him, his expression patient and kind. "I realize that I've been thinking about service in very selfish terms," Louis continued, "worrying about whether what I do feels meaningful to me, whether it makes me feel good about myself. But listening to your stories, seeing how you and others have served without recognition or reward, it's made me understand that real service isn't about how it makes you feel." James smiled slightly. "What do you think it's about then?" "It's about doing what needs to be done, regardless of whether it's comfortable or rewarding or makes you feel important," Louis said. "It's about putting something bigger than yourself first, even when that's difficult." "You're beginning to understand," James said. "But understanding and doing are different things. The test isn't whether you can see what service means, but whether you can live it when it costs you something you want." Louis knew James was right. It was easy to talk about service and sacrifice in the abstract, but much harder to live those principles when they required giving up personal desires or facing genuine difficulty. "I've been thinking about something you could help me with," Louis said. "Something that might help me understand what real service looks like." James raised an eyebrow, curious about what Louis had in mind. "I'd like you to tell me about the hardest decision you ever made in service to my family," Louis said. "The time when doing your duty cost you the most?" James was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing distant. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual, carrying the weight of old pain. "It was 1985, he began. "I had been working protection details for 8 years, had moved up in responsibility and rank. I was engaged to be married to a wonderful woman named Sarah. We had been planning our wedding for months, had saved money for a small house, had our whole future mapped out." Louis waited, sensing that this story would be difficult for James to tell. "In June of that year, we received intelligence about a credible threat against several members of the royal family," James continued. "It was complex, involved multiple targets and locations. The only way to properly protect the family was to assign our most experienced people to an extended operation that could last months." "And you were chosen for this assignment," Louis said, beginning to understand where the story was heading. "I was the logical choice," James confirmed. "But taking the assignment meant disappearing for an indefinite period. No contact with family or friends, no explanation of where I was or what I was doing. Sarah would have no idea why I suddenly vanished from her life." Louis felt his chest tighten as he imagined the impossible choice James had faced. "I couldn't tell her about the assignment. Couldn't explain why I had to disappear. Couldn't even give her a timeline for when I might return," James said. "All I could do was choose between my personal happiness and my duty to protect your family. What did you choose?" Louis asked, though he already knew the answer. "I took the assignment," James said simply. "I broke up with Sarah 2 days before we were supposed to get married. Told her I had changed my mind, that I wasn't ready for marriage. Let her think I was just another man who couldn't handle commitment." The pain in James's voice was unmistakable, even 40 years after the fact. Louis tried to imagine the weight of that choice, the personal cost of prioritizing duty over love. The operation lasted 7 months. James continued. We successfully prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on the royal family. Lives were saved, including members of your family who were too young at the time to understand the danger they had been in. And Sarah? Louis asked gently. By the time I returned, she had moved on with her life, James said. She met someone else, someone who could give her the stability and presence I couldn't provide. She deserved better than a man whose duty would always come first. Louis felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of James's sacrifice. This man had given up the love of his life, had chosen loneliness over happiness, to protect people he barely knew personally but was committed to serving. Do you regret it? Louis asked. James considered the question carefully before answering. I regret the pain it caused Sarah, he said. I regret that she never knew the truth about why I left her. But I don't regret choosing to protect your family. That choice probably saved lives, including the lives of people you care about. They stood together in the library, surrounded by centuries of royal history, and Louis felt the full weight of what service could mean. James Mitchell had shown him that real dedication to duty sometimes required sacrificing the things that mattered most personally. Why are you telling me this? Louis asked. Because you asked, James replied. And because I want you to understand that service isn't always noble or glorious. Sometimes it's just doing what needs to be done, even when it breaks your heart. Louis thought about his own life, his own choices, his own understanding of what it meant to serve. James's story put his concerns about meaningful work into perspective. He had been worrying about whether his royal duties felt significant enough. While James had given up love itself in service to the crown, I don't know if I could make a choice like that, Louis said honestly. I hope you never have to, James replied. But if you did, I believe you would make the right choice. That's what I see in your family, the willingness to put duty before personal desires when it really matters. As they left the library together, Louis felt changed by their conversation. James Mitchell had shown him what service could cost, what real sacrifice looked like, what it meant to put something bigger than yourself first regardless of the personal price, that afternoon. As Louis walked through the palace corridors, he looked at everything differently. The portraits of his ancestors, the ceremonial rooms, the very stones of the building itself, all seemed to carry the weight of centuries of service and sacrifice. He was beginning to understand that he was part of something much larger than his own desires or concerns. Something that had been built and maintained by people like James Mitchell, who had given their lives to protect and preserve it. On the fourth morning of James Mitchell's stay at Buckingham Palace, Louis woke with a profound sense that this day would be different from the others. James would be leaving that afternoon, returning to his quiet retirement and his private battle with illness. But first, the Queen had arranged for one final gathering of the family in the stateroom. As Louis dressed carefully in his formal morning attire, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. James Mitchell's presence had transformed his understanding of duty, service, and the true meaning of royal responsibility. More than that, it had shown him what real courage looked like, what genuine sacrifice meant. The stateroom was filled with morning light when Louis arrived. The same family members who had been present for that first meeting were there again, but the atmosphere was completely different. Everyone now knew who James Mitchell was, what he had done, what he had sacrificed. The man who had once stood unnoticed by the wall was now the center of respectful attention. James stood in the same spot where he had been introduced, but his bearing seemed different. Perhaps it was Louis's changed perception. But the older man appeared to carry himself with quiet satisfaction. As if his mission had been accomplished successfully, the Queen stood near her usual chair, holding a small wooden box that Louis had never seen before. Her expression was solemn but peaceful, the look of someone about to complete an important task. We gather this morning to say farewell to James Mitchell, the Queen began, her clear voice carrying easily through the room. But before he leaves us, I have something that belongs to him. Something that should have been given to him 40 years ago. She gestured for James to approach, and he walked forward with the same steady dignity he had shown throughout his stay. When he reached the Queen, she opened the wooden box. revealing a medal that caught the morning light and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. "The George Cross," the Queen said, her voice filled with emotion. "For gallantry of the highest order, for actions that saved lives and prevented catastrophe, for service that went far beyond the call of duty." Louis felt his breath catch. The George Cross was one of Britain's highest honors, awarded for exceptional bravery in circumstances of extreme danger. He had read about recipients throughout history, but had never witnessed the presentation of such a significant award. "James Mitchell," the Queen continued, "for your actions on September 15, 1982, and for subsequent operations that remain classified until this year, operations that protected not only the royal family but potentially saved thousands of innocent lives, I present you with this medal. This recognition of your extraordinary service to the Crown and to the nation." James stood perfectly still as the Queen pinned the medal to his jacket. His expression remained composed, but Louis could see moisture in the older man's eyes. This recognition, coming after 4 decades of silence, clearly meant more to him than any monetary reward could have. When the ceremony was complete, James stepped back and gave a perfect military salute. But then, in a moment that would be burned into Louis's memory forever, something extraordinary happened. Louis felt himself moving before he had consciously decided to act. Everything James had told him, every story of sacrifice and service, every lesson about what real duty meant, came together in a single, overwhelming moment of understanding and gratitude. Without thinking, without planning, Louis found himself stepping forward and, in full view of his family and in defiance of every protocol he had ever learned, he bowed deeply to James Mitchell. It wasn't the brief nod of acknowledgement that royals typically gave to others. It was a full, respectful bow, the kind that recognized superior worth and honor. Louis bent at the waist, his head lowered, his posture conveying complete respect and reverence for the man who had given so much for his family. The silence in the room was absolute. Louis could feel the shock of his family members, could sense their surprise at his unprecedented action. Members of the royal family did not bow to commoners, no matter how deserving. It simply wasn't done, but Louis remained in his bow for several long seconds, long enough to make it clear that this was not an accident or momentary lapse in protocol. This was a deliberate choice, a conscious decision to honor James Mitchell in the way he deserved to be honored. Regardless of convention or expectation, when Louis finally straightened, he saw that James Mitchell was looking at him with an expression of profound respect and understanding. The older man's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and his slight nod conveyed more approval and acceptance than any words could have expressed. The Queen stood frozen, her face showing shock at her grandson's unprecedented action. In 70 years on the throne, she had never seen a member of the royal family bow to a commoner. The moment stretched out, filled with tension and surprise. Then, incredibly, the Queen herself took a step forward and inclined her head deeply to James Mitchell. It wasn't quite a bow, but it was more than she had ever given to anyone outside of the most formal state occasions. Her action released the tension in the room and transformed Louis's breach of protocol into something else entirely. One by one, other family members followed suit. Prince Charles stepped forward and bowed respectfully to James. Princess Anne curtsied deeply. Within moments, the entire royal family was showing James Mitchell the kind of reverence typically reserved for monarchs and heads of state. James Mitchell stood in the center of it all, a simple man who had lived an extraordinary life, finally receiving the recognition and respect his service had earned. The room was filled with emotion, with gratitude, with the powerful acknowledgement of what real heroism looked like. As the formal acknowledgments concluded, Louis approached James one final time. The older man extended his hand for a handshake, but Louis instead embraced him warmly, something else that broke royal protocol but felt absolutely right. "Thank you," Louis whispered, "for everything you did, everything you sacrificed, everything you taught me. I won't forget." "You don't need to thank me," James replied quietly. "Just live up to what you're capable of. Serve something bigger than yourself. That's all any of us can do." An hour later, Louis stood at a palace window watching James Mitchell's car disappear through the gates and into London traffic. The man who had changed his understanding of service and duty was returning to his quiet life, carrying with him the long-overdue recognition of his extraordinary contributions. But James Mitchell's real legacy wasn't the medal he now wore or the ceremony he had finally received. His true impact was in the lessons he had taught, the perspective he had provided, the example he had set of what real service looked like when it mattered most. Louis touched the window glass gently, making a silent promise to the man who could no longer see him. He would remember James Mitchell's stories, would honor his sacrifices, would try to live up to the standard of service he had demonstrated. Most importantly, he would never forget that real duty sometimes required giving up the things you wanted most for the sake of something greater than yourself. The prince who had bowed to a commoner was no longer the same person who had entered that stateroom 4 days earlier. James Mitchell had done more than receive overdue recognition for his service. He had transformed a young royal's understanding of what it truly meant to serve, what real courage looked like, and what kinds of sacrifices were worth making for something bigger than oneself. As Louis left the window and returned to his daily responsibilities, he carried with him the most valuable gift James Mitchell could have given, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be worthy of the protection and service that others had provided, and a commitment to live up to that honor every day of his life.